Folklore makes me feel like I'm listening to an audiobook, or better yet, like I'm having a virtual 3D experience. The lyrics on this album are so vivid, it has amazing storytelling, it reminds me of Red, but folk-inspired and without the weaknesses that album had, and it's much more cohesive. As most of you may know, Taylor Swift released her 8th studio album, Folklore, seemingly out of nowhere. She described the album as a collection of songs and stories that flowed like a stream of consciousness, rising out of her imagination. It's a very stripped down album and something that you wouldn't expect from an A-list pop star, especially considering her last album releases, which were completely opposite of Folklore. Now let's actually revisit her discography for a minute and go over her progressions, slight regressions, and evolution as an artist, starting with her debut. Her debut album is the weakest in her discography. It's not bad, but I think it has the most filler out of all of her albums. But it was a nice foundation for her to show her songwriting skills. She was only 16 years old when this album was released, and most singers during that time at her age had Disney or Nickelodeon behind them, but she wasn't attached to either and wrote all of her material, which set her apart. Her second album, Fearless, was essentially a reprised version of her first album, but with far better writing, better songs, and this is the album where she really started to brand herself. It can also be considered her breakthrough album. It was really the catalyst for the Taylor Swift takeover of the past decade, and is among her best-selling albums. It's certified diamond. Speak Now was her first step in establishing a more mature image and sound. This album has more elements of country rock. It's also worth mentioning, the album is entirely written by her. It has some of her best written songs like Back to December and Enchanted. Red was the final push for Taylor to go into the pop world. It did receive a little bit of flack for being considered country because it leaned into many different genres like country, pop, dubstep, and so on, but I would say the album's sound is still largely rooted in country and pop, so it could be interchangeable. Now Taylor was already receiving praise for her songwriting skills, but I think Red was truly the album that placed her songwriting skills at the forefront of her musicianship, and really established her as one of the best storytelling songwriters of the decade. 1989 was her huge crossover era, the era where you could simply not escape Taylor Swift. Countless hits, countless records broken, and a ton of accolades. Full pop, no hints of country or mixture of the two. I think the album cuts on 1989 are written way better than some of the singles. For instance, Bad Blood and Shake It Off are not even holding a candle to Clean or All You Had to Do Was Stay. Now don't get me wrong, 1989 still has some incredibly well-written singles like New Romantics, which is so underrated and should have been a massive hit from the era, and even songs like Style and Blank Space show that her songwriting didn't lose its touch just because she switched genres. Reputation was the complete opposite of anything Taylor has ever done. It's pop, it's EDM, it's trap, it's a bit edgy. She completely abandoned the girl next door image and embraced her darker side. It does have its flaws, some of the production sounds a bit dated and it does have some filler. Lover was a return to home for Taylor in a sense. Much more toned down, still pop, but more acoustics and country again. Some fantastically written singles like the title track, and then there's the regression with songs like Me. But overall, Lover is a good album. It's cohesive thematically, and overall it's just a refined album with a lot of strong points. And that leads us to now, Folklore, a surprise album that came to Taylor during quarantine. Folklore is such a calm album, yet it's still the most unexpected thing from a pop star of her status to completely run in the other direction and do an indie album. Acoustics is where Taylor writes her best songs. Not too much production, so her lyrics can really carry the songs and the stories that she's writing about, and that applies to Folklore. Folklore is her best written album by miles. The lyrics could cut glass. Now, since she said these stories are not based on her life and came from her imagination, this is her first non-autobiographical album. Now, my personal interpretation that I got from this album is that it's about a breakup, but not just any breakup. There's a third person involved, and the lyrics in the song August allude to that. She says, "But I can see us last in the memory. August slipped away into a moment in time, cause it was never mine. And I can see us twisted in bed sheets. August slipped away like a bottle of wine, cause you were never mine." And I was like, oh my gosh, did Taylor cheat? And then I realized it's not about her, it's a story she created. The entire album is. Before I found out this album was fiction, Betty is another song that stood out to me. I initially thought it was a song about Taylor's intimate feelings for another woman, but she's actually writing this song in character, so the lover who cheated is experiencing regret for all the wrong they did to Betty. Betty finds out about the relationship in Cardigan. To kiss in cars and downtown bars was all we needed. You drew stars around my scars, but now I'm bleeding. A friend to all is a friend to none. Chase two girls, lose the one. When you are young, they assume you know nothing. So this is basically the realization that there's an affair going on. Exile is the official ending of the affair. I think I've seen this film before and I didn't like the ending. You're not my homeland anymore, so what am I defending now? You were my town, now I'm in exile, seeing you out. And the story ends with Hoax, which is a cleverly titled closer, also alluding to the story not actually being real. She ends the story off by saying, "My only one, my kingdom come undone. My broken drum, you have beaten my heart. Don't want no other shade of blue but you. No other sadness in the world would do." So it seems like Betty forgives the person who cheated on her in the end and wants to continue to be in that toxic relationship. Now that was just my interpretation. I'm not saying it's correct, but that's just what I picked up on the story. Aside from the story, I think Folklore is a pretty great album. The production is so cohesive, the lyricism is amazing, and Taylor's vocal performance is very emotive throughout the entire album. I think Folklore is what was needed for Taylor at this stage in her career. She pulled back on all of the glitz and glamour and what was expected of her, and she supplied the world with a record that allows her songwriting to truly shine. Her calmest record is her most surprising record. Who would have thought? I think this album just reinforces that she is truly one of the greatest songwriters of this generation.